The wealthy man's daughter had remained silent her entire life until he observed his African-American nanny and his child singing a tune that instantly shattered his perception of reality. Richard Blackwood stood motionless in the nursery doorway, watching his 6-year-old daughter, Isabella, flawlessly sing a French song, while Kesha, the nanny he had hired out of pure desperation, played the piano alongside her. Isabella, who had been diagnosed with selective mutism at age 3, had not uttered a single word in more than 2 years. Yet, she was there, singing with the voice of an angel. "What in the world is happening here?" Richard bellowed, startling both of them. Isabella immediately fell silent, her blue eyes filling with terror, as Kesha swiftly rose from the piano bench. "Mr. Blackwood, I can explain," Kesha offered. "Explain?" Richard stormed into the room, his voice heavy with a rage that caused Isabella to retreat behind Kesha. "Explain how you managed to make my daughter speak when the top specialists in New York stated she might never talk again." Kesha Johnson, 28 years old, fully understood the implication of that tone, having worked for the Blackwood family for the past 2 months. She had come to realize that Richard viewed his daughter as a failed endeavor, a social liability that needed to be kept hidden from high society gatherings. The man squandered immense wealth on expensive therapists who treated Isabella like a laboratory experiment, but he had never simply attempted to communicate with her. "Sir, Isabella has always possessed the ability to speak," Kesha responded calmly, placing her hand reassuringly on the girl's shoulder. "She chooses when and with whom she speaks." "She chooses?" Richard scoffed derisively. "She is 6 years old and practically mute. The physicians declared it a severe neurological condition, and suddenly you, a nanny with no medical background, can cure her in 2 months." The disdain in Richard's voice was undeniable. To him, Kesha was just another expendable employee, hired because her salary demands were considerably lower than those of specialized agencies that had given up on Isabella after only a few weeks. "I did not cure her, sir. I listened to her," Kesha stated, feeling Isabella clutch her hand. "And Isabella shares incredible narratives with me daily. She is proficient in 3 languages and plays 4 different instruments." "Lies," Richard spat out the words. "My daughter can barely communicate. The medical evaluations are quite explicit regarding her limitations." Then Isabella performed an action neither adult had anticipated. She emerged from behind Kesha, looked directly at her father, and declared in a clear, mature voice, "Daddy, I do speak. I simply do not speak to individuals who are unwilling to listen to me." The ensuing silence was overwhelming. Richard turned pale as if he had encountered a phantom, while Kesha beamed with pride at her daughter's bravery. "That's impossible," Richard mumbled, stumbling backward. "The doctors, the examinations, years of therapy." Isabella continued, her voice gaining strength. "Kesha asks me about my thoughts. You only ask the doctors what is wrong with me." The devastating simplicity of that statement struck Richard like a physical blow. He gazed at his daughter, truly looked at her, and for the first time perceived not a damaged child, but an intelligent, self-aware girl who had been silenced by a world that preferred to categorize her rather than comprehend her. However, Richard Blackwood was not the sort of man who would admit his errors, especially not in front of an employee he considered inferior. His expression hardened once more. "Kesha, you are dismissed. I want you out of my residence immediately." "No!" Isabella shrieked, clutching Kesha's dress. "She cannot leave. She is the only one who comprehends me." Richard completely disregarded his daughter's distress. "You have somehow manipulated my daughter. I am unaware of the schemes you have employed, but that is quite enough for today." Kesha remained composed, even as she watched Isabella begin to weep silently. There was an unspoken determination in the nanny's gaze that made Richard pause for a moment, as if she possessed knowledge he lacked. "As you wish, Mr. Blackwood," Kesha said softly. "But before I depart, Isabella has something to reveal to you, something that might alter your perception of your own daughter." If you are enjoying this narrative about how prejudice can blind even a father to his own daughter's potential, remember to subscribe to the channel because what Kesha was about to disclose regarding Isabella would not only transform that family's life but also demonstrate that sometimes the most valuable treasures are concealed directly beneath our noses. You have 15 minutes to gather your belongings and depart from my property, Richard declared, pulling his mobile phone from his pocket. And if you attempt to contact my daughter again, I will involve my legal team. Kesha observed the man dialing a number, likely for the private security firm that managed the mansion. Richard Blackwood epitomized the type of person she had learned to identify after years of serving Manhattan's elite families, wealthy enough to acquire anything except the capacity to perceive his own daughter as a complete human being. Mr. Blackwood, Kesha stated calmly, despite seeing Isabella still clinging to her dress. May I at least explain what I have uncovered about Isabella over the past 2 months? There is nothing to discover, Richard interrupted her, ending the call. My daughter has clear limitations, diagnosed by competent professionals. You are not a physician. You are not a therapist. You are merely a nanny who managed to teach a few tricks to a confused child. The word merely resonated through the room like a sharp blow. Kesha Johnson had earned her degree from Columbia University with high honors in child psychology, was fluent in 4 languages, and held specializations in cognitive development and childhood trauma. Yet, to Richard, she would always be just a black nanny he had hired for 20% less than what specialized agencies charged. Daddy, please, Isabella pleaded, these being her first words spoken to her father in over 2 years. Kesha taught me that I am intelligent. She teaches me things the doctors never did. Richard did not even glance at his daughter. His gaze remained fixed on Kesha with a coldness she knew all too well, the expression of someone accustomed to discarding individuals like disposable objects. Isabella, go to your room. The new nanny will arrive tomorrow morning, he commanded, as if addressing a disobedient dog. I don't want a new nanny, Isabella screamed, clutching Kesha's dress even tighter. I want Kesha. She doesn't treat me as if I'm broken. It was then that Richard did something that astonished even Kesha, who was accustomed to the veiled cruelty of high society. He lifted Isabella with excessive force, completely disregarding her cries and pleas, and handed her to Carmen, the housekeeper who had appeared at the door. Carmen, escort Isabella to her room and secure the door. She is not to leave until I have resolved this, he instructed, as if giving directions about refuse. Kesha! Isabella shrieked as she was pulled from the room, her tears echoing down the hallway. Do not abandon me. Please do not abandon me. The sound of Isabella's bedroom door being locked cut through the air like a gunshot. Kesha stood motionless, absorbing the absolute callousness of this man who had just traumatized his own daughter to preserve his convenient interpretation of reality. Now, Richard turned to Kesha with a smile that did not reach his eyes. You have 10 minutes. If you do not depart voluntarily, I will summon security. Kesha Johnson had grown up in Brooklyn, the child of a cleaning lady and a bus driver. She understood intimately the sensation of being undervalued, dismissed, and treated as inferior by individuals who mistook wealth for intellect. But she had also learned something that Richard Blackwood had yet to discover. The most perilous people are those whom you completely underestimate. Mr. Blackwood, she stated, maintaining a steady voice as she gathered her purse. May I pose a simple question? Richard glanced at the gold Rolex on his wrist with exaggerated impatience. Quickly. Do you genuinely believe your daughter is incapable, or are you afraid to discover that she is more intelligent than you presume? The question struck Richard like a blow to the stomach. He took a step toward Kesha, his fists clenched. How dare you challenge my competence as a father? I have expended a fortune on specialists, therapies, treatments. I have done everything for my daughter. Everything except listen to her, Kesha responded softly. Isabella does not require more therapists, sir. She requires a father who believes in her. Richard laughed scornfully. Parenting advice from a babysitter in her 20s who does not even have children. What a jest. Kesha opened her purse and retrieved a small digital recorder. Mr. Blackwood, over the past 2 months, Isabella has confided many things to me. Narratives about how she feels when the doctors discuss her as if she were not present. How saddened she becomes when you cancel dinner parties because you are embarrassed to take her out. How she feigned an inability to walk correctly during a doctor's appointment because she realized that the more impaired she appeared, the more attention she received. Richard's complexion gradually paled as Kesha spoke. Your daughter is not mute, Mr. Blackwood. She is a brilliant child who has learned that silence is the sole means of obtaining affection in a household where being different is treated as an illness. Richard violently snatched the tape recorder from Kesha's hands. You are not authorized to record anything in this residence. This constitutes an invasion of privacy. Isabella granted me permission, Kesha replied calmly. She desired for someone to finally hear her voice. And there are numerous additional recordings, sir. 2 hours of conversations where your daughter exhibits an advanced vocabulary, a comprehension of classical music, and an emotional insight that would impress any psychologist. Reality began to emerge in Richard's eyes like a distant tempest. For the first time, he grasped that he had profoundly underestimated not only his daughter but also the woman standing before him. What do you desire? He inquired, his voice. Kesha smiled for the first time since Richard had entered the room. It was not a triumphant smile, but something far more potent, the expression of someone who possesses information capable of dismantling carefully constructed worlds. I desire for you to cease treating your daughter as a failed endeavor and to begin perceiving her as the extraordinary child she has always been. But beyond that, she paused, extracting another recorder from her sleeve, I desire for you to comprehend that some individuals you consider mere employees possess the precise knowledge of how to document inconvenient truths. From the hallway, Isabella could still be heard crying in her locked bedroom, calling Kesha's name. The sound permeated the tense atmosphere between the two adults like a constant reminder that at the heart of this clash of wills was a 6-year-old child who simply yearned to be understood. Richard looked at Kesha with a mix of anger and something she recognized as fear. For the first time in his existence, he had encountered someone who was not intimidated by his wealth, his social standing, or his threats. Someone who possessed something he could not acquire, the truth about his authentic identity as a father. Every new humiliation Richard attempted to inflict only fueled an inner resolve within Kesha that he failed to perceive. A determination honed over years of battling prejudices far more severe than his own. What this privileged man was unaware of was that each act of contempt provided her with the exact ammunition she needed for a conflict he hadn't even recognized he was losing. Proving that sometimes the greatest strength emerges precisely when others believe they have shattered our spirit. 3 days had passed since Kesha's expulsion from the Blackwood mansion, and Richard believed he had finally resolved the issue of the troublesome nanny. He had engaged a new caregiver through Manhattan's most exclusive agency. Margaret Foster, a 60-year-old British woman with impeccable credentials and, more crucially, the absolute discretion he demanded. Isabella hasn't uttered a single word since the new nanny arrived, Carmen reported nervously, finding Richard in his office. She refuses to leave her room, isn't eating properly, and is making those peculiar noises again when she becomes agitated. Richard did not even glance up from his financial reports. That is natural. She needs to adapt to the new routine. Miss Foster is a qualified professional, not an amateur. The telephone rang, interrupting their conversation. Richard answered impatiently, but his expression drastically altered when he heard the voice on the other end of the line. Mr. Blackwood, this is David Martinez from the law firm Martinez and Associates. I represent Miss Kesha Johnson in a matter that may be of mutual interest. Richard motioned for Carmen to leave and closed the office door. I am unaware of what you are referring to. That woman was terminated for legitimate reasons. Interesting, the lawyer's voice remained calmly professional, because I possess a rather extensive dossier concerning racial discrimination and child abuse. My client has meticulously documented her experiences within your home. This is extortion, Richard roared, but his voice betrayed his anxiety. I retain the finest legal counsel in New York. That nanny cannot afford to confront me. David Martinez chuckled softly. Mr. Blackwood, you may not be aware that Miss Johnson graduated with the highest honors in child psychology from Columbia, holds a specialization in child trauma and cognitive development, and is currently pursuing a master's degree in children's rights at NYU. She also maintains a blog on child development followed by over 200,000 professionals in the field. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Richard felt the ground vanish beneath him. But what is most intriguing, the lawyer continued, are the recordings she possesses, not only of Isabella demonstrating exceptional cognitive abilities, but also of certain revealing conversations about how you refer to your own daughter when you believe no one is listening. Richard vaguely recalled the instances he had spoken on the phone with doctors, referring to Isabella as a lost cause or a dead end. He had always assumed he was alone in his office. "What do you desire?" he inquired, his voice. "For now, merely a civil discussion. My client is not vindictive, Mr. Blackwood. She genuinely cares about Isabella's well-being, but she also will not permit a brilliant child to be harmed by parental prejudice." Meanwhile, across town, Kesha sat in a small apartment she shared with two fellow master students, meticulously reviewing months of notes, recordings, and photographs. Every interaction with Isabella had been documented not out of malice but from an academic habit of recording exceptional child development. Dr. Sarah Chun, Kesha's mentor and professor of child psychology at Columbia, analyzed the recordings with an expression of growing indignation. "Kesha, this is extraordinary. Isabella not only demonstrates superior intelligence but has developed sophisticated coping mechanisms to deal with systematic emotional neglect. This child is safeguarding her own mental health through selective mutism." "I know," Kesha replied calmly. "And her father believes he is healing Isabella with therapists who treat her as if she is mentally disabled. He is causing irreversible psychological damage." Dr. Chun picked up one of the recordings where Isabella sang an entire opera in Italian. "With your permission, I would like to present this case at next week's Child Development Conference. It serves as a perfect illustration of how family biases can obscure giftedness." "Not yet," Kesha stated, carefully putting away the files. "First, Richard Blackwood needs to grasp that his daughter is not a problem to be concealed. She is a treasure he is squandering." Back at the mansion, Margaret Foster fruitlessly attempted to coax Isabella into eating something during dinner. The girl remained silent, pushing her food around her plate with a distant expression. "She used to be like this before the other nanny arrived," Richard explained coldly to the new employee. "This is her typical behavior. Do not be misled by dramatic ploys." Margaret, an experienced professional, observed Isabella with increasing concern. In 40 years of caring for children, she had never witnessed a girl so clearly traumatized being treated with such indifference by her own father. "Mr. Blackwood," she said cautiously, "perhaps the child would benefit from a more individualized approach. She clearly possesses above-average intelligence." "Isabella has distinct limitations diagnosed by experts," Richard interrupted her. "Do not encourage fantasies. That is precisely what the previous nanny did, filling her head with impossibilities." That night, after Richard had retired to his office, Margaret attempted a different strategy. She sat beside Isabella and whispered, "I know you can hear me, sweetheart. You don't have to speak if you don't wish to, but I would genuinely like to get to know you better." Isabella looked up for the first time in 3 days. Slowly, she wrote something on a napkin and handed it to Margaret. "Is Kesha coming back?" It read in surprisingly mature handwriting. Margaret looked at the girl, seeing for the first time not a troubled child, but a desperately solitary little girl. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I do know that you are far more special than anyone in this house comprehends." Isabella smiled sadly and wrote another sentence. Kesha knew that. As Margaret tried to process the emotional complexity of the 6-year-old, her phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "Hello, Margaret. I am Kesha Johnson, Isabella's previous nanny. I know you are a serious professional and that you must be observing unusual dynamics within the family. If you wish to discuss what is truly occurring in this household, please reach out to me. Isabella requires our assistance." Margaret gazed at Isabella, who had fallen asleep on the couch, still clutching the napkin with her inquiries about Kesha. For the first time in her career, an experienced professional found herself questioning whether remaining in a particular home was more detrimental than beneficial to a child. Across town, Kesha had finished organizing what she had begun to refer to as Project Isabella, a comprehensive compilation that would prove not only the girl's genius but also the systematic neglect she endured. David Martinez had clearly stated that they possessed a strong legal case. However, Kesha desired something more fulfilling than a court victory. She wanted Richard Blackwood to publicly acknowledge the extraordinary daughter he had disregarded for years, because some men only learn when they forfeit everything they believed they possessed. And Richard was about to discover that he had underestimated not merely a competent nanny, but a woman who would transform every act of contempt into fuel for a form of justice that would completely reshape Isabella's future, demonstrating that sometimes the greatest retaliation is simply to reveal the truth that people so desperately attempt to conceal. 1 week later, Richard Blackwood awoke to a series of notifications on his mobile phone that chilled him to the bone. The first was an email from the New York Department of Children's Services requesting an urgent family welfare assessment for the Blackwood residence. The second was a missed call from his personal attorney. The third was a message that would alter his life forever. Mr. Blackwood, press conference today at 3 p.m. at Columbia University's Children's Rights Center. Your presence is advised. KJ. Richard rushed to his office and immediately contacted David Martinez. What the hell is happening? Why does social services want to evaluate my home? Mr. Blackwood? His lawyer's voice was tense. You need to come to my office right now. We have a much more serious situation than we had anticipated. An hour later, Richard was seated in a conference room, observing a presentation that systematically dismantled everything he believed about himself as a father. Sarah Chun, one of the nation's most respected experts in child development, delivered the presentation with surgical precision. These recordings were made over a 2-month period by a qualified professional with the child's explicit permission, Dr. Chun explained, playing the audio of Isabella singing an entire opera in Italian. As you can hear, the girl possesses not only exceptional vocal ability but linguistic mastery that indicates giftedness. Richard was pale but attempted to maintain his composure. These recordings were made without my consent. They are illegal. David Martinez gravely shook his head. Actually, they are not. New York law permits educational documentation when there is suspicion of child developmental neglect. And there's more. The subsequent recording was even more devastating. Isabella's voice, clear and articulate, explained to Kesha, "Daddy always tells the doctors that I don't comprehend things. He talks about me as if I'm not present. Yesterday, he mentioned on the phone that I'm a non-returnable investment and that perhaps he should send me to a special boarding school." Richard felt his world collapse. He vaguely remembered that phone call, thinking he was alone in his office. There are 17 hours of similar material, Dr. Chun continued relentlessly. Isabella consistently demonstrates superior intelligence, emotional stability when treated appropriately, and a painful understanding of how she is perceived by her father. But the worst was yet to come. The projector screen displayed a series of medical reports from the past 3 years, all signed by Richard, all minimizing or distorting Isabella's actual abilities. Most disturbing, Dr. Chun said, is the correspondence we uncovered between Mr. Blackwood and Isabella's therapists. Emails where he explicitly requests them to maintain diagnoses that justify her social disability, his exact words. Richard tried to stand, but David restrained him by the arm. "Sit down and listen. It's not over yet." Kesha Johnson entered the room carrying a bulging folder. She showed no anger or vindictive satisfaction, only the quiet determination of someone who had meticulously documented an injustice. "Mr. Blackwood," she said calmly. "For 2 months, Isabella recounted to me how she pretended to have greater difficulties than she actually did because she realized that the more limited she seemed, the more attention she received from her father. A 6-year-old child manipulating adults to obtain basic affection." Richard finally erupted. "You manipulated my daughter. You instructed her to lie, to feign abilities she does not possess." "Actually," Dr. Chun interrupted, The neurological tests we have conducted over the past few weeks confirm that Isabella has never had any cognitive limitations. The selective mutism was a response to systematic emotional neglect. Kesha opened the folder, revealing hundreds of drawings, musical compositions, and even short poems that Isabella had created during those 2 months. Isabella did not need to be cured, Mr. Blackwood. She needed to be seen. But the doctors, Richard stammered. The doctors responded to your expectations, David Martinez explained coldly. When an influential and affluent parent repeatedly insists that their daughter has limitations, professionals tend to discover evidence that confirms that narrative, especially when that parent pays very well for convenient diagnoses. The final blow came when Dr. Chun played the most recent recording, made just 3 days earlier, with Isabella conversing fluently with Margaret Foster about philosophy and advanced mathematics. What amazes me most, Isabella's voice echoed through the room, is how Dad never realized that I always knew he was ashamed of me. I just pretended to be more limited because it seemed like the only way he would pay attention to me. Richard collapsed into his chair. All his arrogance dissipated. I just wanted to protect her. I wanted her to be normal, happy. You wanted her to conform to your version of normal, Kesha gently corrected. And when she didn't, you preferred to believe she was broken rather than accept that perhaps your definition of normal was too narrow. David Martinez placed a document in front of Richard. The Department of Children's Services is considering a supervised joint custody plan. Isabella will continue to reside with you, but with mandatory psychological counseling, not for her, for you. And there's more, Dr. Chun added. Isabella will be integrated into a program for gifted children at Columbia, where her abilities will be appropriately stimulated. Miss Johnson will serve as her official educational tutor. Richard looked at Kesha with a combination of anger and something resembling despair. What do you want from me? I want you to be the father Isabella deserves, Kesha replied simply. I want you to see your daughter as the extraordinary child she has always been. And I want you to understand that some of the people you consider mere employees may perceive treasures that you yourself have overlooked. Today's press conference, David informed him, will present Isabella's case as a groundbreaking study of how family biases can obscure giftedness. Miss Johnson will be recognized as an associate researcher at Columbia. Richard finally comprehended the full extent of his defeat. Not only had he lost credibility as a father, but the simple nanny he had scorned was about to be nationally celebrated as the person who rescued a gifted child from years of intellectual neglect. Does Isabella know all this? He asked, his voice breaking. Kesha smiled for the first time. Isabella helped plan everything. She truly wants her dad to learn to see her for who she is. She told me, Kesha, Daddy isn't bad. He just forgot how to look at me without being afraid. The forgiveness implicit in those words from a 6-year-old was more devastating to Richard than any legal punishment could have been. He had been vanquished not by rage or retribution, but by the wisdom and compassion of his own daughter, a girl whose genius he had systematically ignored because she did not conform to his narrow concept of normality. As the adults finalized the legal intricacies of that family revolution, one question lingered. Was it possible to reconstruct a father-daughter relationship when the father himself had discovered that he had spent years battling phantoms he had created, while the true treasure was right before him, patiently waiting to be acknowledged for what she had always been, an extraordinary child disguised as a problem to be solved? 6 months later, Richard Blackwood sat in the front row of the Columbia University auditorium, observing his 6-year-old daughter receive a Medal of Honor for academic excellence. Isabella, now proficient in 5 languages and the composer of 3 original musical pieces, appeared on stage as the child prodigy she had always been. "Daddy," she whispered as she stepped off the stage. "Are you proud of me now?" Richard embraced his daughter, tears streaming down his face. "I've always been proud of you, Princess. I just had to learn to see it." Kesha Johnson, now a nationally recognized doctoral candidate and child development consultant, watched from the audience alongside Dr. Sarah Chun. Her book, Invisible Children: How Prejudice Kills Potential, had become a bestseller. Richard approached her after the ceremony. "Kesha, I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize," she gently interrupted. You need to continue being the father Isabella always knew you could be. Margaret Foster, who had become a crucial ally in the family's transformation, smiled as she watched Isabella run through the garden with other gifted children. Kesha's true victory was not to destroy Richard Blackwood, but to transform him into the father Isabella deserved. She demonstrated that sometimes the greatest triumph is not defeating our adversaries, but saving them from themselves. If you believe that every child deserves to be seen for their true potential, not what others expect of them, subscribe to the channel. Because when we stop judging by appearances and begin truly listening, we discover that the greatest treasures are hidden behind our own prejudices.